We talked a little bit about sampling versus specializing. I remember vividly, I think it was like the headmaster of one of these elite schools. It may or may not have been where Bill Gates went to school, and it may or may not have been the principal or head of the school that he attended while he was attending it. But I remember what he said, which is that when he looked at the parents of the kids who ended up being very successful, the parents were watching their kids like hawks for what sparked their kids' interest. And I know it sounds like kind of like a, soft or hooky thing, but you know what? If your kid's not interested in something, they're not going to be great at it. And so looking for those, I think looking for flickers of interest is more important than looking at flickers of talent.
Professor Duckworth, where does this podcast find you?
It finds me at my office at the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay, so let's bust right into it. Your research focuses on two traits that predict achievement, grit and self-control. Can you break these down for us?
I think self-control and grit are members of the same family. Call them cousins if you want, maybe even siblings, but they're not the same thing. So the family is really the psychology of effort. I mean, these are two traits that describe people who put forth effort toward goals. Grit, which I'm probably a little better known for, is about expending effort toward very distant goals. So goals that might take years or even a lifetime to accomplish. Self-control is also about effort, but these are goals that are kind of everyday goals. Like, I have to floss my teeth. I should go to bed instead of scrolling through Twitter. I should really get my taxes filed before April 15th. So self-control and grit are related because they're both about effort toward your goals. But I think grit is actually driven by having a kind of passion and resilience. And self-control, we could talk more about it, but it's like delayed gratification, ability to resist temptations in the moment.
I just had a question from a guy who's a former Green Beret. And when I think of grit, I think that the armed services are very good at instilling grit in people. One, do you agree with that? Or two, how do you reverse engineer to the fundamentals of building grit?
I think the military is good at developing, and probably also, when you talk about the Green Berets or the SEALs or the Rangers, Special Forces, also for selecting for grit. I don't want to say anything that you or I ever talk about is without genetic influence. But I also can't think of anything you and I talk about that is entirely fixed. And if it's not just, genetic destiny, then the question is, what are the environmental influences? And Scott, you've got me now exactly what I'm thinking about these days. And I'm not going to tell you that I have it all figured out, but I've been obsessed would be one way to think about it. It's like, what are the environments that enable people to A, express the grit they already have, and B, develop more grit than they had before? So I just want to answer succinctly and say, absolutely, I think it's possible. Then, you and I can, talk about, my ideas, your ideas about what specific environments those are.
I think I'm curious if you, literally just thought of this, but I'll throw this thesis at you that what would help to understand or be a different dimension on grit or helping to understand it is what is the opposite of it. And I think the opposite of it is being entitlement. A belief that things are going to come to you easy, or you give up easily, or you get frustrated when your problems aren't solved. Thoughts?
When you said thinking about the opposite, well, the first word that came to my mind was not entitlement; it was dilettante. And by the way, if Tolstoy is right that every family happy family is alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in their own way, then maybe gritty people are alike, but to not have grit takes different forms. I've thought about that quote a lot, maybe not necessarily in the context of grit. And I do think Tolstoy was right. And I would answer your question this way. I don't think there's one opposite of grit. I think entitlement might be one way to not be gritty. I think being a dilettante is not the same. And I think that's another way. So the useful answer is what is it that makes gritty people gritty? And then the absence of those things, if there are a plurality of assets that make gritty, then all of those are ways not to be gritty. And I absolutely have thoughts on that. I mean, just to give you, an elaboration of my example about dilettante, and I know that word has negative connotations, But I will say this, to be gritty is to be obsessive about something. You wake up and you're thinking about it again, and you wake up and you think about it again, and, you know, to you, it's exhilarating, to other people, it's exhausting, and so one asset that you have to be passionate about something for your whole for your whole life in the extreme, but for years, is a kind of, like a kind of devotion, right? And that's why I think one of the first things that leaps to my mind as not being gritty is to be somebody who, as soon as the learning curve starts to plateau a bit, right? It's not, pure novelty. You're sort of like wandering off to a different learning curve. So again, forgive me the pejorative connotations. I think it's actually a completely legitimate way to lead your life. I know people I like a lot who are the opposite of obsessive. They don't want to get deep. And I think that's actually morally just as good as somebody who has this tendency to want to get deeper and deeper and deeper and more nuance.
But generally speaking, they're not as successful, right? I mean, what I like about your work is it's not. When I first read your book, it felt to me like I'm not going to talk about the way the world should be, but what it is.
Yeah, I I know, Scott, I have my critics, and by the way, uh, I don't necessarily disagree with the criticism, but I will stand firm, at least for myself, on this. I think people who are world-class achievers, I think to a one, they have grit. And I think this, last element that we're talking about, this, like, obsessiveness, oh my gosh, call it
Hmm.
confirmation bias, but holy smokes, I see it all the time. I interview somebody who, is that they're making their way in the stand-up comedy world. I mean, I'll just give you my last conversational example is talking to this guy named Gary Simons, and he's a stand-up comic. He's 25, graduated from Georgetown. He's making it, right? And just this conversation, I'm like, oh yeah, that's grit. Like, his here are the Google Docs from the people that I interviewed. So, how'd you find them? Well, I went to the Georgetown, fellowships office, and I looked up alumni who might have something to do with this, crazy career that I want to do. And here are all the times I DM'd Mike Birbiglia, and he finally wrote me
God,
back. And
it's so
then,
funny. I was just thinking of Mike. He's on
oh,
open
really?
mic night all the time. He just texted me. The guy will text me individually, A, because I'd like to think he likes me, but he wants to spread. He is literally hand to hand combat. And I think that's what people miss is to get.
Yeah.
I always say after working my ass off for 30 years, I'm an overnight success. I don't think young people appreciate. Beyonce has Einstein. They all had amazing.
Everyone, right? Beyonce, Einstein, Mike Birbiglia, Mike Birbiglia's protege. I think I'm right about that, right? And then the question is like, what are the multiple assets? Because your question is very revealing. What is the opposite of grit? I think there are multiple opposites. And say you are that person with kind of a tendency to get obsessively interested in something and to stay loyal to it and to come back to it. That's only one thing. Like, that's not the same thing as resilience in the face of setbacks. Okay, well, that's another way to not be gritty, right? Because if you don't have that, we can unpack the psychology of that. But I think one of my advisors in my undergraduate years is a very famous professor, now passed, named Jerry Kagan. And I remember that when I kind of grew up and became a psychologist like him, we had a very brief conversation about grit, and he was like, it's too many things. Like, it's unwieldy because it's too many things. But I think when you look at very successful people, they do have this, like, composite quality, of passion and perseverance, and the elements of those 2 as well.
I agree. I know a lot of talented people. Talent is sort of, you know, table stakes. But the thing that sends you into outer space or puts you in the top 10 or 1% is, the willingness to break through hard things, going, I'm fond of saying success is in the last 10%, the people who just go the extra mile. What do you see in high school students in terms of background or any observations, anything that you can reverse engineer to someone who's likely going to develop grit and other components and be a quote unquote super achiever?
So let's break grit down into its, 2, its 2 facets. So there's passion and perseverance. Because when you talk about young people, I think it's important to distinguish those. I mean, it's important for all of us, but let's take perseverance first. So yeah, I mean, there are high school students who are, clearly much harder working and much much more
Mm-hmm.
resilient than others. I think that's something which continues to develop, but you can see it. It's often in sports. Honestly, there are other ways in which you can develop and express this quality, but I can't tell you how biased I am toward varsity athletes. It's like, give me a
100%.
give me a 4-year varsity athlete. Let's go. Like, so you can see that at 17 or 16. So that's perseverance. And again, we can unpack
Mm-hmm.
that. I do think the elements of a really persevering young person or older person, like I think to some extent you can reverse engineer those qualities. You're like, wow, they're such optimists. Where does that come from? What are their beliefs and so forth? But let me also say that there's another half of grit that is not as obvious from the word grit, and that is passion. And when I say passion, I really do mean a kind of intrinsic desire, an intrinsic interest in what you're doing. And the reason I like bringing up the hypothetical high school student is there's a paradox for passion, which is this. I think at your age, my age, this specialization that we have, everything connects in some way to what we are interested in. So we are hyper specialized. We might cross fertilize, but there's a center of gravity. That's what we look like when we're all grown up. But when you're
Mm-hmm.
16 or 15 or 14, you're in an entirely different developmental stage. I don't think it's healthy or even on the road to grit to be obsessively narrowly focused on one thing when you're a teenager. I think actually the data would suggest, and this is actually research from other scientists, not mine, that paradoxically, what leads to specialization is sampling. It's the opposite. It's kind of, Rowdy Gaines doing like a half dozen sports before he decides to become a swimmer, right? And sports, which we were just talking about, is one of the fields in which this has been
Mm-hmm.
best documented, that athletes who become world
Mm-hmm.
class are more likely
Mm-hmm.
to have sampled broadly in their youth than prematurely specializing. So I'm always careful, or I try to be, when I talk about grit with young people, because I don't want them to think that butterflies started out like little butterflies. Butterflies started out as caterpillars.
So we should have disclosed at the beginning of the show that this podcast is basically a vehicle for me just to talk about myself. So be forewarned. But I'm going to give you three
Scott, my
examples.
mother said that when anyone's talking to anyone, they're always talking to themselves, and I think she was right.
100%.
Yeah.
But I think a lot about grit, and I just think it's hard to argue with. And what's interesting is I think the most insightful books and work is people state the obvious, but they hadn't thought about it. And your book was sort of everyone said, well, of course it is, but no one really kind of explored it. My life was gritless growing up. I was an underachiever, lazy, just kind of sleepwalking
Really?
through. Oh yeah, just totally sleepwalking through life. And there were three things that I think gave me what I believe is a great deal of grit. The first is my mom got very sick, and it was very shocking at a young age to be faced with that kind of illness. And I remember thinking, there's no way, I don't know how to handle this. I can never get through this. And
How
you
old were you?
do. Oh, I was in graduate school, so it wasn't like it happened when I was a kid. That actually happened last, but just emotional fortitude, realizing that life is tough and you get through it. That confidence gave me a little bit more, I don't know, courage or resilient, whatever the term is. But the two other things were in college, I rode crew, and I was a varsity athlete, and at one point in a race, you wouldn't be able to feel your legs. It'd be like fire going down your esophagus. You would have these mental tricks to try and not pass out, and that was at 800 meters, and you would go 2,000. And it gave you this sense of when you think you're at your limit, emotionally, physically, psychologically, when you really think you're at your limit, you think, I just can't take anymore. That means you're about a third of the way there. And most people never are in a position to really push their limits. They never develop that. They never really test the boundaries of their limits. And then
They
the other
assume the boundaries, right? Is
that's
what
right.
you're thinking.
And they think they're much tighter than they actually are. And then the other thing was at Morgan Stanley, there was such an intolerance for mediocrity. You could be fired if there was a typo in the memo you sent out, 18 hours a day, abusive work culture, given a clean white shirt if you did an all-nighter. So there was all this kind of cultural pressure to work around the clock. a massive amount of pressure on perfection and an intense, borderline abusive work environment gave me those kind of three legs of a stool of grit. Do you see those as common attributes in people who develop a certain level, or common shared experiences in people who demonstrate grit?
Well, I have a hypothesis, and I think you named half of it. I think grit is forged in a crucible, half of which is challenge. I mean, what is challenge? Challenge is being asked to do something you cannot yet do, right? 2,000 meters instead of 800, like whatever it is, right? I can't do it. The challenges exceed my resources or my abilities. So I think that is half of it. But, when Nietzsche said, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, I mean, it does make you wonder, like, well, you look around and it does actually kill or seriously wound, uh, a lot of people. And I think that's because the other half of the crucible, and you can agree or disagree with me, is some kind of support. Like, where does that inner self-talk come from that says, I'll show you, right? Because I
Mm-hmm.
think if there was one phrase that I have heard over and over again in interviews of the grittiest people, it's that when they describe confronting a major challenge, especially when they're doubted, right? And someone else tells them, like, well, you can't do this. There is this rage, this like voice that says, I'll show you. And my theory is that being in one challenging situation after another is not enough to give you the voice that says, I'll show you. Somewhere there has to be support. Somewhere there has to be like, I can't remember Rocky's coach, like the guy
Yeah.
with the
Burgess Meredith.
exactly,
Yeah.
right? Like the sailor, like the beanie on, or like, I think I've seen it too often, that people who are in challenging situations without support, are not the ones to get up again, dust themselves off, like learn something, come back stronger than they were before. So how do you like that hypothesis that
I
the
like
crucible
that.
of grit is a challenge plus support? And you could argue that people aren't getting them in the right doses or neither, but I think those are elemental.
I love that. One of my favorite sayings is that always stuck with me. One of my venture capitalists, again, I'm Larry Bond from General Catalyst, always said, greatness is in the agency of others. And hearing you speak, I'm like, grit is in the agency of others.
Hmm.
I love that
Can you tell me
notion.
more about that expression, which I've only heard for the first time from your lips?
Well, greatness is in the agency of others. I mean, think about the platform you're at Penn, right? Would you have nearly the impact you're having without great research associates, great colleagues, all the people who've come before you at Penn, your publisher? Probably not your publisher. I found they almost do fucking nothing. But anyways, but they're
My husband, how about that?
yeah,
That's a
whatever
uncomfortable.
your
Yeah.
colleagues that support you, the person proofreading your book, the person doing the research, that the people. Generally, I find greatness, or people, they have to have their own grit. They have to demonstrate grit. But what that does is it inspires the people around them to do great work for them. You can't, people think Malcolm Gladwell is in his kitchen, like doing these videos and everything. He's got a team of like dozens of really talented people. And
Editors, producers.
100%.
Scott, I only learned very recently from friends who are authors who shall remain nameless because I didn't know this, and I don't know that they'd be wanting to keep it a secret, but it was a secret for me that writers that I really respected have, like a cadre of people. Like, oh, I don't just have like this editor who is assigned to me by my publisher. Like, I send it out to this person and that person, and like conceptual stuff. And, what's on my mind, recently is, how that feels like anti-heroic in a way. Like there's something about DIY that is like, that's the way to go. Like you're supposed to be a solo performer. And if you need anybody else's assistance, then like, there's like 100 grit points. And like, if they get 20, you only get 80. Right. Um, and now when I'm interviewing people who are really successful and gritty, I'm hearing, and maybe it's because I'm looking for it, Scott. Like, so maybe I'm, hunting for what I'm looking for. But what I'm hearing are people who are virtuoso at actually getting like their environments to be their ally, and not their opponent. So they will take anything. It's like any edge for it's not cheating for them to use their situations to their own advantage.
We'll be right back. Professor, do you have children?
I have two. They are 23 and 21.
How did this work impact your approach to raising kids?
When I started graduate school, I was pregnant with Lucy, and I think I was still nursing Amanda. So I was becoming a mom at the same time as I was becoming a psychologist. And because I really didn't know anything about psychology, I really was starting from scratch, right? I wasn't a psychology major. I had majored in neurobiology. I had a master's in neuroscience, but it was really a very different thing. So I was learning about everything, Piaget for the first, I mean, everything. And then I would come home and turn the key in the lock, and then I would walk over the threshold and I would be a mom and not a psychology student. But of course, it was all the same me. And so I feel like my study of self control and of grit and of effort the foil for those things, which are, whatever it is to be innately talented or naturally intelligent. I mean, it was just all in my head. And I think how it influenced my parenting, and I should say our parenting, because my husband Jason and I were you know, talking every night about like what I was learning as a researcher. I mean, I did raise them to believe that excellence comes from, pick your favorite quote, but let's take John Wooden, the UCLA basketball coach, right, who said there are 8 laws of learning: explanation, demonstration, uh, imitation, get the repetition. Oh, and then the last ones are easy: repetition, 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 repetition. So 5 of the 8, right, are the same. So I did raise them to not think of excellence as a magic trick. They're 23 and 21, so they're still sampling. But I will say, I think they, drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak.
Do you think I'll start with a thesis. I coach a lot of young men. My general, and there is some research here that while physically stronger, boys are emotionally and psychologically weaker than girls. If they're raised in a single parent household, they're much less likely, their outcomes are worse when they lose a male role model. Whereas when girls go from dual parent to single parent homes, they have similar outcomes. They're more resilient. Have you found any research that finds that young women are more resilient or demonstrate more grit than young men?
I had a female neurosurgeon approach me, and it's been a few years, so I can't remember much about the interaction except for that she had a hypothesis. She said, there aren't many of us, meaning female neurosurgeons. In fact, they apparently, if I recall correctly, which I may not because it's been a few years, like they have a number because there's so few that it's like a deli, you get the next number. I don't know what number she was, 125 or whatever she was. And she said, I just can't believe that there's equal grit among the female and the male neurosurgeons, in part just because of selection, right? It's like a fine mesh sieve, and we're still here. So we did do a little study. Or she, I should say, I just gave her the grit scale. The grit scale is a 12-item questionnaire and has very obvious items. Setbacks don't discourage me. I finish whatever I begin. It's got passion items about having consistency in a goal for very long periods of time. And when the data came back, I'll tell you, she did not find a statistically significant gender difference, I think, favoring either side, honestly. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't any. There are lots of, boring aspects of self-report questionnaires that we can talk about. One of them, though, that's very relevant to looking at gender differences is something I study. It's called reference bias. So, Scott, if you take a questionnaire and I take a questionnaire and we read the same item, I am a hard worker, you first conjure up an image of a hard worker, and then you measure yourself to that standard. One of the things that I think may obscure gender differences is that if that person has higher standards, then you have two forces that are working in opposition. On one hand, they may really be grittier. On the other hand, their higher standard is going to yield a lower score. And this has absolutely been documented in cross-cultural research. So in one study, there are over, I think, 60 countries, and it wasn't a grit scale, but it was a measure of overall conscientiousness, right? Big 5 conscientiousness, being orderly and responsible, and I, imagine like, detail oriented, but also, by the way, this is the family that includes grit and self-control. So that family, and they gave it to people in all these different countries. And then the very simple question was like, what are the most conscientious countries in the world? And when the data came in, it was fairly shocking because whereas the, leaders were not especially clear, but what I remember from the paper was that the losers were. So the lowest conscientious countries were, I think, Japan, like South Korea, like maybe China. I mean, these countries that stereotypically you're like, really? Like, really? And what I believe, and I think what the authors of this research report also believe, is that what you're really revealing there are standards, right? It's probably that, the same words are on the paper, but they're essentially answering different questionnaires. So on gender, I have not found reliable gender differences in grit. I
That's
don't
probably a good
know,
thing.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
I don't know whether there really are. But I will say this. I think I have to be careful because I think I'm actually biased towards women. So I'm aware of that. Um, I will say there is a gender difference that we haven't talked about that goes against your hypothesis. And I'll say these are data that come from like giving women tasks like an IQ test and men the same IQ test. There are differences in confidence. There are differences in, like, okay, you just took this test. Scott, what do you think you did? Like, how do you, oh, I think I did great, right? Women with the same score will be like, oh, terribly, right? So I think there are differences in confidence that are not necessarily justified, but also would work against your hypothesis.
You have a new book you've been writing on the power of the situation. You say that the entire book can be summarized with this sentence: achieving your goals is easier when you make your situation your ally. That feels very obvious, putting yourself in the right room, the right context, the right platform. Say more about that. Do some people not recognize the importance of the context or the situation?
I think there are, two reasons why people do not recognize the power of the situation. One is, Viktor Frankl's, the message that people heard from Man's Search for Meaning, that some people heard, is that, well, unfortunately, you cannot change your circumstances, but you can change how you respond to them. I don't think that's actually what Viktor Frankl meant. I mean, I don't think Viktor Frankl was like, so what? There are concentration camps and Nazis, and our entire people are being extinguished. What really matters is our attitude, because we have to control the controllables. So I think there's a kind of misunderstanding. I think many circumstances are given, but not all. And I think that impediment, that kind of like, oh, you got to control the controllables, meaning yourself. And, this list of things that you can't control gets rounded up to be everything, right? So I think people do overlook the situation in part because they assume it's a given. And the second reason is that even when you can control your story, let's take Ozempic as one very controversial example, right? Um, I think there are people who would consider taking Ozempic for weight loss to be a form of weakness, a sort of kind of, well, if you were stronger, if you, were just more disciplined, if you well, then you wouldn't need to rely on this crutch, right? People think like using ChatGPT is cheating, right? And I know you can actually cheat with ChatGPT, but these are just two features of your situation that you could use to your advantage or not use to your advantage. So the second reason I think we overlook the power of the situation is that it feels like cheating when the situation is helping us. And the very cover of Grit, which I don't even know if I have back here, but anyway, on this bookshelf, there might be a copy of Grit. And if I pulled it out, it's this one big arrow going to the right against these little arrows that go to the left. And the idea of Grit, I think, is about overcoming aspects of your situation for sure. But I think what that leaves out, it's not that this book is a correction, but I do think it's a completion of the idea, is that it's great to have a big arrow pointing to the right. It's great to work hard. It's great to pick yourself up and be resilient. But why not do that in a river that's flowing in your direction?
Last question here. 2 or 3 pieces of advice to parents who recognize the importance of grit and want to do what they can to try and instill a sense of grit, putting their kids in the right context or situation to be successful. Like if you try to distill it down, and every book on parenting I read just kind of says to me, no one has any idea. Every book I read seems to contradict the one before it. But are there two or three things that you would say are kind of tried and true in terms of helping your kids establish this fantastic competence?
I think every kid benefits from having a kind of surrogate parent at a certain point, often in their teen years, sometimes younger. And what I mean by that is, their track coach, their violin teacher, the AP history teacher who really pushed them. And why are these surrogate parents so like, I don't know, essential even is one word
To
that comes to
listen to
mind.
them.
Well, exactly, because we are rejecting the actual
Right.
parents that we have,
Right.
and these, I watched it with my own kids, like, you gotta outsource some of these parents because, there's almost nothing you can do. Yeah, this one day, my daughter comes home from, like, track practice, and she was like, "Oh, you gotta get to bed early, I need to drink water," like, I can't be eating all this crap. And I was like, wait, like, I've been saying all these things, especially on the sleep. And it's like, oh, because her track coach told her, right? So I think one thing is outsourcing some of the modeling. And I think that does come through extracurricular activities almost always, right? And I guess the second thing is, we talked a little bit about sampling versus specializing. I remember vividly, I think it was like the headmaster of one of these elite schools. It may or may not have been where Bill Gates went to school, and it may or may not have been the, principal or head of the school that he attended while he was attending it. But I remember what he said, which is that when he looked at the parents of the kids who ended up being very successful, the parents were watching their kids like hawks for what sparked their kids' interest. And I know it sounds like kind of like a, soft or hooky thing, but like, you know what? If your kid's not interested in something, they're not going to be great at it. And so looking for those, I think looking for flickers of interest is more important than looking at flickers of talent, right? Not just like what seems to come easily to your kid, but what holds their attention. Those are the seeds of passion.
So I lied. One final question. What can kill grit? What do you need to avoid? What can get you stuck or reduce the levels of grit?
Well, we talked about the situation. We, don't have a whole conversation on burnout, but I do think there's a there's a nuance here. Like if you just look at correlations between grit and burnout, the grittier people are less burned out. That's honestly not shocking. But I think really gritty people are in some ways at the highest risk of burnout because slackers don't get burnt out. And gritty people work so hard and they are so tenacious. So what imperils grit? I think when you asked about, what are the environments, the crucible, I said, like, I'm listening to your story. I hear a lot of challenge. I'm guessing that there's another through line of support somewhere in there, or Scott
Hmm.
wouldn't become Scott. So I think burnout is what happens when you try really, really hard in a very gritty way, probably, and somehow things are just not working for you. And when that happens, I think looking outside of yourself instead of inside yourself, looking at what could make it easier to accomplish your goals, as opposed to berating yourself for not trying harder. Honestly, Scott, that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, forgive yourself. Angela Duckworth is a psychologist, the co-founder of Character Lab, and a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. She joins us from her office at the great educational institution, the University of Pennsylvania. Professor, you literally own a character attribute. That is such good for you. Well
Oh,
done.
it's not patented. When the Flyers named the Philadelphia Flyers hockey team, when they named their mascot Gritty, no royalties were exchanged, nor should they have
Yeah,
been.
but more importantly, yeah, when people say to your kids, "Who was your mom?" My mom was the grit woman. There's just a lot worse things you could say about people. Congratulations on your success.
Thank you, Scott.